Okay, so here I am with some thoughts about the Stoa Lincoln Douglas topic for the 2015-16 season about liberal arts versus practical education. But before I get to that, I'm going to make my administration and our admissions office happy by taking just a second to say that Northwest Christian University gives scholarships for forensics, $2,000 renewable annually. And one detail you might want to know is that people who competed in Stoa or NCFCA go to the front of the queue. So if it's you against someone who competed in NFL or TOC, to be perfectly honest, we'd rather have you. So when it comes time for you to go college shopping, that's something you ought to keep in mind. All right, liberal arts versus practical skills. I don't think you're going to have that much trouble finding arguments on the affirmative, because in the same way that whenever a reporter is kidnapped or killed in the field, all of a sudden it's wall-to-wall news, because people have a lot to say. They have very developed thoughts about what interests them. You'll also find that people who write for a living are very, very quick to defend the liberal arts. And I think deep down, a lot of us are suckers for the idea that the liberal arts are transformative, and then that when people have been trained in the wisdom of the ages, and when they have worked at generating arguments and writing, and they have all those tools in their toolbox, that they really can bring about sweeping reform, and they can awaken people's conscience, and so forth and so on. And some of the arguments you're going to make on the negative, you're going to be a little bit more cynical and try to bring that down to earth. But your problem on the affirmative, I think, is going to be to take the absolute tsunami, the absolute ocean of arguments that you will find when you just sit down and do a simple Google search and filter them, and how to separate what's strong and is going to survive a couple of rounds of refutation from what's dross and is clever but won't really stand up under scrutiny. What I want to do is I want to give you 3 book recommendations, and you're at the time of the summer when you can take a little time and you can read a book-length work and you can digest it and turn the arguments over in your mind. So the first one that I want to recommend is by Fareed Zakaria, and it's hot off the presses. It's a 2015 book, and it's entitled In Defense of a Liberal Education. In Defense of a Liberal Education. The second book I want to recommend that you read is by a philosopher, so right in the groove for Lincoln Douglas debate. His name is Michael Oakeshott. He is a political philosopher, and the name of the book is The Voice of Liberal Learning. One other book that I think is a good start, a good way to lay down a foundation, is by Cardinal Newman, and it's The Idea of a University. And we should definitely remind ourselves that the topic does not say college, it says formal education. So it's also referring to liberal arts education at every stage, primary on up. But a lot of what is written about the dilemma of liberal arts versus skills-based, practical skills-based curriculum, it really kind of centers around college. So I think you may find that the arguments that people bring up in that controversy, the controversy about what kind of college should you choose, I think those are the arguments that you're going to hear in a lot of rounds. Now, it's going to be a little bit trickier finding good arguments on the negative, because you won't find that many people who set out explicitly to say the liberal arts approach is completely bankrupt. You'll find a lot of people who make jokes about it. You'll find a lot of people who will say it casually, informally, but there are not that not that many really well-developed step-by-step arguments. So here are some jumping off points for how I think you could construct a pretty good case against liberal arts education. I think, first of all, you want to go and look for the phrase return on investment. Look for people who talk about higher education in particular, and sometimes education in general. They sometimes talk about choosing a private school or the investment of time being tied down to finishing up your education. And they talk about if you're going to pour your resources in, that you cannot afford to be romantic. And in that context, when they talk about what approach to education provides the best return on investment, that is where they will take serious broadsides at the idea of liberal arts. And that's where they'll say you need to know what you're learning, and you need to know what it equips you to go out and do. So return on investment along with education, I think, is a good search to start generating some arguments. A second one is the phrase, college isn't for everyone. College isn't for everyone. And sometimes people they'll take up that thesis, and in association with it, they'll talk about vocational education or trade school. And very often they speak glowingly of the approach in Germany, where fairly early in people's education, they're put in a track, and the trade schools are fairly well respected, and people who finish the trade schools go on to have pretty satisfying lives. They're able to support a wife and family, a husband and family, and they are able to participate fully and feel themselves to be valued members of the community, even though their education was oriented to skills, not to liberal arts. A final one that you might look at as far as search terms or themes is to look at the idea of apprenticeship. Apprenticeship. And that, of course, not in the historic medieval sense, but look at apprenticeship with career, apprenticeship with unemployment, apprenticeship versus college, and you'll find that there are people who write about how we need to return to that model today, that we need to think of the final stages of education as, pretty much being in practice in almost an internship position for the work that you're going to do later on. And the defenses of that, some of the philosophical defenses of that, some of the conceptual defenses of that, I think will make some pretty good arguments for why that's a more valuable learning experience than getting grounded in the liberal arts. One other thing that I want to equip you with, I found a humanities professor. He's got a blog called My Fall Semester, myfallsemester.blogspot.com, and he writes under what I'm pretty sure is a pseudonym, but he had a post back in 2009 about a particular lesson he teaches to his students, and the lesson is he goes in and he makes the case against the liberal arts. And there are 4 lines of argument that he develops. And I want to lay these out for you because I think these may be good starting points for you putting together a good negative case. The first argument that he makes is that the liberal arts do not make society better. And he develops this, and all these arguments, I have to say, they're a little bit cynical. They're a little bit about puncturing the romantic view of the liberal arts. He says that the way society runs, it does not run on reason, it runs on power. And having skill and being able to bring about an outcome is a better, more sustainable source of power. And that very often when you're reasoning is just sort of a pageant. It's just sort of put on for appearance sake. You might think about how in Congress, the speeches that they give, that they air on C-SPAN, they don't listen to each other and they don't persuade each other. They do that to make it look as though they're a deliberative body, but really what they do is they cut all the deals in one another's offices and out in the cloakrooms. He says that's a pretty good image for how power works throughout society. And because of that, the liberal arts do not make a difference. And he even has a good fallback claim, the kind of thing that's very valuable later in the debate in your last rebuttal. He says, even if it's true that individuals can be swayed by reason, even if you concede that, groups do not. And he says that the makeup of society, the fabric of society, is people's group affiliation, and groups are held together by their agreements, and their agreements are usually unexamined. You do not sway an entire group with reason. Groups hold on to their power. So that's line of argument number 1. Line of argument number 2 is that the liberal arts are elitist. The liberal arts are elitist. It could be a fine moment for you if your opponent on the affirmative says that the unexamined life is not worth living, because that's his jumping off point for making this argument about elitism. He says, for those who cannot reflect on their own lives, who just don't have the capacity to do it, you are saying that they are subhuman. And really, when you think of education as the building up of skill, having a skill and being able to go out and bring about an outcome, that is the basis, that is the substance of freedom. That is going out and constructing your own life. And people like to talk about the liberal arts and how it's preparation to function in democracy. But what better participation in democracy is there than going and living your life and exercising your freedom? Coming to a deliberative gathering and bouncing your arguments with other people, yes, that may be the way democracies make decisions. That may be civic participation, but being empowered to go out and use these freedoms that we like to banter about, that really is democracy in action. Think of it as the difference between maintaining your car, which would be going to a deliberative meeting and bouncing your arguments around, and actually driving your car, which would be going out and exercising your freedoms. So that's line of argument number 2. Here's line of argument number 3. We are all specialists now. The liberal arts are obsolete. The idea that you can become fully competent across an entire area of activity is the idea of a bygone age. The only thing you can do if you go broad, if you try to be a generalist, if you try to fill your toolbox with tools instead of specializing, is you learn just enough to be ineffective. You learn just enough to go out and make a fool of yourself. The idea that you can be trained to be an effective writer, well, a writer for who? A writer of what kind? If you are a good creative nonfiction writer, that doesn't mean that you're a good technical writer. And if you're a good technical writer, that doesn't mean that you're a good legal writer. In every area of endeavor, there are now specialties. And so therefore, trying to hold on to the liberal arts because we're going to miss them when they're gone is like trying to hold on to buggy whip manufacturing just because someone's made his living off it and can't stand the fact that the automobile has arrived. Human endeavor moves on, human activity progresses through different stages, and the time when the liberal arts were sustainable may just be behind us. And the fourth and final argument, and I think this one may be my favorite, and I think it might be the one with the most potential, is he says that even if the liberal arts are vital, even if the affirmative is right that the liberal arts are the pinnacle, the apex of the educational experience, we have no idea how to teach them. We have absolutely no evidence that our methods of teaching them are effective. We have no assessment tools for the liberal arts that give us any kind of meaningful data. Instead, what we have is almost this performance and then this romanticized view that exposure to great literature, exposure to classical ideas, that rehearsal of argument and speaking and writing and all of that somehow makes a difference. But whereas in lots of other areas, you can assess people's performance of a skill. You can set them up in situations and have them use the skill, and you can see for yourself that they can do that. You can't do that with the liberal arts. And we sort of plunge ahead in the dark and we assume that our teaching methods work, but there's no hard, fast proof that they do. And really, what's more likely is the liberal arts might be that important, but we have no idea how to teach them. The people who wind up being successful, who wind up mastering the liberal arts, are largely the ones who start out with the capacity and have the high motivation, and they teach themselves. So, those are some directions to start with. You can start with a couple of good reads on the affirmative, and you're going to have more arguments than you know what to do with. On the negative, I think you're going to have to be a little bit more cagey, but I think if you go some of these directions, you're going to wind up with some slightly depressing, down-to-earth, realistic arguments, but I think this can wind up being a pretty evenly matched topic, and I think you're going to enjoy your debates this year.